This story is about a man who thought his life was over, a man hiding from his past in a lonely cabin, waiting for the world to forget he ever existed. But on a quiet evening, when the sun was bleeding out across the prairie, his past didn't just find him. It knocked on his door, and it was the size of a little girl. The wind out on the plains has a way of talking to you. It whispers secrets through the tall grass, tells stories of the men who came before, men who broke, and men who were broken. For Silas McCrae, the wind mostly just reminded him how quiet his life had become. His cabin was a forgotten thing, warped wood and faded memories, clinging to the edge of the world. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, not since he'd cursed out a rattlesnake for getting too close to his woodpile. Before that, it might have been a week. Words were like coins. You didn't spend them if you had no one to buy anything from. Silas wasn't old, not by the years on a calendar. But guilt had a way of aging a man from the inside out. It had carved hollows under his eyes and put a permanent stoop in his shoulders. His limp, a souvenir from a bullet that had decided to make a home in his thigh, was a constant, grinding reminder of a life he'd tried to bury. He was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of wood into nothing in particular, when he heard it. A knock. It was so faint, he thought it was a branch tapping against the roof. He ignored it. Then it came again. A little louder this time. A little more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was a sound that didn't belong out here. No one came this far off the trail. Not unless they were lost or running from something terrible. Silas let the whittling knife clatter onto the table. His hand drifted toward the old revolver hanging on a peg by the door, a habit from a life he no longer claimed. He decided against it. Trouble was loud. This was quiet. He pulled the door open, letting the dying light spill in, and he saw her, a little girl, no taller than his knee, with eyes as green and wide as the whole damn prairie. She was shivering in a thin dress, her feet bare, and her face smudged with dirt. In one hand, she clutched a worn-out corn husk doll, its yarn hair unraveled. She looked up at him, this broken giant of a man, with no fear at all. Her voice was small, but steady as a rock. "My mommy can't walk anymore," she said. Then she looked him right in the eye and delivered the 5 words that shattered his entire world. "Please help, Daddy." The silence that followed was deafening. The wind stopped. The crickets went quiet. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Daddy. The word echoed in the empty spaces of his memory, a ghost from a life he'd lost. For a split second, the little girl's face blurred, her green eyes turning brown, her straight hair replaced with the brown curls of his own lost daughter, Clara. His mouth went dry. He tried to form a word, any word, to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't who she thought he was. "I'm not," he started, his voice a rusty croak. But the girl wasn't listening. She just turned and started walking back into the twilight, as if she knew, without a doubt, that he would follow. He hesitated. For a moment he thought about closing the door, about letting the silence swallow him up again. It would be easy. It would be safe. But then he looked at her small back, disappearing into the growing darkness, and he knew he couldn't. Some part of him, the part he thought had died with his daughter, wouldn't let him. He pulled on his cracked boots, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the cold. He followed her through the tangled brush and over dry creek beds. She moved with a strange confidence, never once looking back to see if he was there. It was like she was pulling him along with an invisible string. He tried to ask her questions. "What's your name? Where is she?" But the words felt like stones in his mouth, clumsy and heavy after so long without use. The sky deepened from purple to a black velvet blanket pricked with stars. The air grew teeth. Finally she stopped. At the crest of a small ridge, tucked into a makeshift shelter of broken branches, a woman lay on the ground. She was curled on her side, her face pale and slick with fever. Her dress was torn, and one of her legs was bent at an angle that made Silas's stomach clench. He knelt beside her, his own bad leg screaming in protest. Her pulse was a faint, thready beat against his fingers. She was alive, but barely, a ship sinking slowly into a dark sea. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and cloudy with pain. "Don't leave us," she whispered, her voice like sandpaper. "Please, don't leave us." Silas looked from the woman to the little girl, who was now stroking her mother's hair. He opened his mouth to tell them again, to say the words, "I'm not your husband. I'm not your father." But what good would it do? Out here, in the dark, with the coyotes singing their hungry songs, names didn't matter. Survival did. He stood up, slipped his arms under the woman's shoulders and knees, and lifted her. She was terrifyingly light, like a bundle of sticks. The girl, June, followed him like a shadow as he began the slow, agonizing limp back to the cabin. He laid the woman on his own bed and stoked the fire until the room was warm. He fetched water and clean rags. He found an old jar of salve and gently began to clean and set her swollen ankle. As he worked, her eyes opened again. This time, they were a little clearer. "You know how to fix people," she murmured. "I used to," he said, more to himself than to her. He glanced over at the girl who had curled up by the hearth, fast asleep. A good man would have offered her a blanket. A good man would have felt something. Silas just felt tired. He turned back to the woman. "You got a name?" Her eyes slid closed again as she drifted off. "Evelyn," she whispered. "Evelyn Cartwright." The name hit him like a physical blow. Cartwright. He'd known that name. A family of criminals and moonshiners from a place called Bitter Hollow. Violent men who used the Bible as a weapon and the law as a suggestion. He remembered dragging a Jedediah Cartwright to jail one summer, a wild-eyed man who'd nearly beaten a farmer to death for looking at him wrong. He stared at the woman on his bed with a new, cold suspicion. Who was she? And what kind of trouble had she brought to his door? The wind howled outside, and the cabin, which had been his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The little girl stirred by the fire. She sat up, her green eyes finding his in the dim light. She walked over to him, not saying a word, and leaned her small head against his knee. He flinched at the contact, his body rigid. He was a fortress, and she was laying siege to his walls. "My name's June," she whispered, her voice soft as a moth's wing. "Mommy said you were a good man." A good man? The words were a bitter joke. He hadn't been a good man in a decade. He was a ghost, a failure, a man who had been cleaning his gun when his daughter drowned in a creek. He stared into the fire, the flames crackling like distant memories. He didn't look down at the girl. "Go to sleep, June." She didn't argue. She just curled up at his feet, her doll clutched to her chest, and fell asleep. Silas stayed awake all night, watching them. The woman, Evelyn, breathing easier now. The girl, June, small and trusting. He felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Something he hadn't felt since he'd buried Clara. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, Silas McCrae closed his eyes and whispered the first prayer he'd said in 10 years. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just asked for the strength to get through the day, because he had a terrible feeling that the trouble June had led to his door was just the beginning. The real storm was still coming, and he had just invited it inside. The next morning, the silence in the cabin was different. It wasn't the empty, comfortable silence of solitude. It was thick with questions. Silas made oatmeal, setting a bowl in front of June. The girl ate like a starving wolf, not even looking up. It was a hunger he recognized, the kind that comes when your world has been ripped out from under you. On the bed, Evelyn stirred. Silas helped her sit up, his touch impersonal, careful. He was a mechanic fixing a broken machine, nothing more. "You could have left us out there," she said, her voice still raspy. "Could have," he grunted, not looking at her. He retreated to a corner and started cleaning his rifle, the familiar click and slide of the mechanism a comfort. "You live all alone?" she asked, her eyes taking in the sparse, lonely room. "Suppose I do. Far from town. That's the point." His answers were walls built high and strong, but Evelyn kept chipping away at them. She told him her story, a story about her husband dying and her cruel brother-in-law, Jedediah Cartwright, trying to claim her and June for his twisted church, a cult he called the Fold. She said they'd been running for weeks. It was a good story, a believable story, but something about it felt rehearsed, too neat. People running for their lives didn't have neat stories. They had ragged, bleeding wounds. Then she dropped the name. Jedediah Cartwright. Silas stopped cleaning his gun. The name hung in the air between them. I know him, he said, his voice flat and cold. Dragged him to a cell once. Caught him whipping a man and quoting scripture at the same time. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. What wasn't she telling him? Why did he feel like a pawn in a game he didn't understand? You brought danger here, he said, staring out the window at the endless prairie. I brought my daughter, she snapped back, her voice suddenly sharp. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Later, she asked him about his own daughter. The question came out of nowhere, a sharp jab in an old wound. He didn't want to tell her. He didn't want to give her a piece of himself, but the story tumbled out anyway. Clara, 10 years old, the creek, the scream he heard too late, his wife leaving him, telling him he loved his sheriff's badge more than his own family. Did you? Evelyn asked softly. I think I did, he admitted, the words tasting like ash. That night, after June and Evelyn were asleep, Silas did something he hadn't done in years. He searched their belongings. It wasn't much. A small bundle of clothes, a few dried flowers, June's corn-husk doll. He felt a pang of guilt, but suspicion was a stronger master. He picked up the doll. It was crudely made, but there was something odd about it. Sewn into the back, almost invisible against the dried husk, was a small leather pouch. His fingers, clumsy and thick, worked at the stitching. It came loose and something fell into his palm. It wasn't a coin, it wasn't a locket. It was a key, old and ornate, made of dark, heavy iron. It was a key to a lockbox or a chest. It was the kind of key that protected something valuable, something worth running for, something worth killing for. He stared at the key, the firelight glinting off its strange, toothed design. Evelyn's story was a lie. They weren't just running from a religious fanatic. They were running with something. He quietly stitched the pouch back onto the doll and placed it beside the sleeping girl. He looked at Evelyn, her face peaceful in sleep. She looked like a victim. She sounded like a victim. But victims didn't carry keys like this. He sat down in his chair, the rifle across his lap, and watched them for the rest of the night. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a powder keg, and he was sitting right on top of it, holding a lit match. The days that followed were a quiet, tense dance. Silas said nothing about the key. He watched. He listened. He saw the way Evelyn's eyes would scan the horizon, the way her hands would tremble when a sudden noise broke the silence. She wasn't just scared of being found. She was scared of losing something. He saw the way June would clutch that doll, not like a toy, but like a shield. Whatever secret they were carrying, the girl was a part of it. He and Evelyn fell into a strange routine. He would chop wood, and she would tend to the small garden he'd long since neglected. He would hunt, and she would cook. They moved around each other, two planets held in a delicate, unspoken orbit. They talked, but their words were just surface noise, ripples on a deep, dark lake. He never mentioned the Cartwrights. She never mentioned the key. It was a secret that sat between them at the dinner table, a ghost in the room. One afternoon, Silas was reshoeing his horse when he noticed something. Tucked into the saddlebag was a small, leather-bound book. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't his. He opened it. Inside, in neat, elegant script, were lists, names, dates, figures. It looked like a ledger. He flipped through the pages, his blood running cold. These weren't farming accounts. The names were people he recognized from his time as sheriff. Prospectors who had disappeared, travelers who had vanished on the road. Beside each name was a number, a weight, in ounces, gold. This was a record of robberies, of murders. And at the bottom of the last page, there was a signature. Not Jedediah Cartwright's. The name signed with a confident flourish was Evelyn Cartwright. Silas slammed the book shut, his mind reeling. He had been a fool, a blind, sentimental fool. This woman wasn't a victim running from a monster. She was the monster, or at least she was his bookkeeper. This explained the key. It wasn't for her savings. It was for their stolen fortune. He stormed back towards the cabin, the ledger clutched in his hand, fury a hot iron in his gut. He was going to throw them out, right now. Let Jedediah have them. It was Cartwright business, and he wanted no part of it. He threw the door open, ready to unleash his rage. Evelyn was standing by the fire, humming a soft tune. June was at the table, drawing a picture on a piece of scrap wood with a piece of charcoal. She looked up at him and smiled, a pure, innocent smile that cut right through his anger. "Look," she said, holding up the drawing. "It's our house." It was a crude drawing of the cabin, but there were three figures standing out front: a man, a woman, and a little girl, all holding hands. Silas looked from the drawing to Evelyn's calm face, and his resolve crumbled. He couldn't do it. He couldn't throw them out to the wolves, no matter what they had done. But he couldn't let the lie continue. He tossed the ledger onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud, and the humming stopped. Evelyn's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking fragile and terrified. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "In your saddlebag," he said, his voice hard as stone. "You want to tell me what a list of dead prospectors is doing in your possession? You want to tell me why your name is signed at the bottom?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" he shot back. "It looks like you and Jedediah were partners, a holy man and his angelic bookkeeper, robbing and killing your way across the territory." "No!" she cried, her voice breaking. "He killed them, all of them. My husband. He was Jedediah's brother. He was part of it. He helped him. I wrote it all down. I kept the records. I thought if I had proof, I could get away, that I could use it against him." It was a good explanation, almost too good. "And the key?" Silas asked, his voice low. "The one sewn into your daughter's doll. What does that open?" Evelyn's face crumpled. She looked at June, then back at Silas. "It opens a lockbox," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The one with all the gold. It's buried near here. That's why we came this way. I was going to take it and disappear." So that was the truth, or part of it anyway. She wasn't an innocent. She was a thief trying to steal from other thieves. She had used him, used his cabin as a hideout, used his daughter's memory to play on his sympathies. He should have been furious, but looking at her, seeing the genuine terror in her eyes, he felt something else, a grudging respect. She was a survivor. She was doing whatever it took to protect her child. "He's not just coming for you," Silas said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "He's coming for the gold, for the ledger, and for the key." "I know," she whispered. The air in the room crackled with the new, terrible truth. They weren't just hiding. They were guarding a treasure, and the hunters were closing in. That night, as a storm rolled in across the plains, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundations of the cabin, Silas made a decision. He had been running from his past for 10 years. He had let guilt turn him into a hollow man. But now this woman and her child, with their dangerous secrets and their desperate lies, had given him something he hadn't had in a long time, a reason to fight. He looked over at June, asleep by the fire, her hand resting on the doll that held their fortune and their fate. He looked at Evelyn, staring into the flames, her face a mask of fear and determination. He wasn't a good man. He knew that. But maybe, just maybe, he could be the man they needed him to be. Just for a little while. He picked up his rifle and began to clean it again. But this time, he wasn't just passing the time. He was preparing for war. The calm before the storm is a funny thing. The world goes quiet, holds its breath. For 2 days, the prairie was peaceful. Too peaceful. Silas used the time. He taught Evelyn how to load and fire the shotgun, her hands surprisingly steady. He showed her the root cellar beneath the floorboards, reinforcing the door with a heavy iron bar. It was small and damp, but it was defensible. He walked the perimeter of his land, noting every rock, every ditch, every tree that could provide cover. He was a sheriff again, planning a defense, his mind sharp and clear for the first time in years. He and Evelyn didn't talk about the ledger or the gold. The truth was out. A dangerous animal they had both agreed to leave in its cage. But the knowledge of it changed things. There was a new intensity between them, the bond of two soldiers hunkered down in a foxhole, waiting for the bombs to fall. He saw the strength in her, the steel beneath a soft, frightened exterior. She saw the man he used to be, the protector, emerging from the shell of the hermit. On the third day, the peace broke. Silas was on the roof scanning the horizon when he saw it. A single rider, moving fast, not coming towards the cabin but cutting north, towards the town. A scout. Jedediah wasn't just going to ride in blind. He was gathering information, gathering forces. Silas knew he had to act. He couldn't wait for the fight to come to him. He had to take it to them. "I'm going to town," he told Evelyn. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Silas, it's a trap. He wants you to leave." "It's the only way," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need supplies. I need to know what we're up against. And I need to send a message." He looked at her, his hand covering hers. "Trust me." The ride to town was a race against time. The wind was at his back, pushing him onward. The town was a dusty, sleepy place that hadn't changed in the 10 years since he'd turned in his badge. But the people had. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear, the ghost of Sheriff McCrae, the man who'd lost his family. He ignored them. He went to the general store, buying up every box of ammunition they had. The storekeeper, old Marty Dunn, looked at him with worried eyes. "Expecting trouble, Silas?" "Trouble's already here," Silas replied, his voice grim. As he was leaving, he saw him, one of Jedediah's men. He had a scar across his cheek like a jagged lightning bolt, and the dead empty eyes of a zealot. He was talking to the town blacksmith, his voice low and menacing. Silas walked over, his limp more pronounced than usual, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. The scarred man turned, a smirk on his face. "Well, well, if it ain't the retired lawman." "You're a long way from Bitter Hollow," Silas said, his voice even. "Looking for something." "Just spreading the good word," the man sneered. "And looking for a thief, a woman, and a little girl. Seen 'em?" Silas met his gaze, his eyes like chips of ice. "The only thieves I see around here are the ones hiding behind a Bible." The man's hand went to his gun. The blacksmith backed away, his face pale. The street went silent. For a long moment the two men stood there, a spark away from an explosion. Then Silas smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. "You tell Jedediah something for me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You tell him I know about the ledger, and you tell him to come get it. If he's man enough." He turned and walked away, not waiting for a reply. He could feel the man's eyes boring into his back. He had just thrown down the gauntlet. He had turned his cabin from a hiding place into a target. He had signed their death warrants. The ride home was even faster. He pushed his horse to its limit, the dread in his stomach a cold, hard knot. Had he made a terrible mistake? Had his pride just gotten them all killed? When he saw the cabin, his heart stopped. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. "Evelyn!" he screamed, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped. He ran inside, his gun drawn. The cabin was empty. The fire was cold. They were gone. A wave of nausea and despair washed over him. He had failed. Again. He had left them alone, and now they were gone. He sank into a chair, the weight of his failure crushing him. Then he saw it. On the table, propped up against a tin cup, was June's drawing of the three of them. And beside it, something was scratched into the wood of the table. A single word. Cellar. He scrambled to the trap door, his hands shaking. He pulled it open. Evelyn and June were huddled in the darkness below, their faces pale but unharmed. Evelyn looked up at him, a shotgun held tightly in her hands. "Someone was watching the cabin," she whispered. "I saw them in the trees. We've been hiding for hours." Silas felt a flood of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He reached down and helped them out. He looked at Evelyn, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes fierce and determined. He looked at June, who immediately ran to him and hugged his legs. In that moment he knew he hadn't made a mistake. He had made a promise. He had drawn a line in the sand. This was his home. These were his people, and he would burn the world down before he let anyone harm them. "They're coming," Evelyn said, her voice quiet. I know, Silas replied, bolting the door and barring it shut. Let them come. He went to the window and looked out at the setting sun. The prairie was bathed in a beautiful, bloody light. It was the kind of sunset that promised a dark night ahead. For the first time in a long time, Silas McCrae wasn't afraid of the dark. He was ready for it. He was the man who had been hiding in the shadows for 10 years. Now the shadows were his to command. The night was a long, suffocating blanket of silence. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. Silas sat by the window, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. Evelyn sat by the fire, the shotgun never leaving her lap. June slept on a pallet of blankets, her corn-husk doll held tight against her chest. The key, the ledger, the gold. It all felt so small and unimportant now. All that mattered was the steady rise and fall of the little girl's chest. Just before dawn they came, not with a thunder of hooves but like ghosts, figures moving through the tall grass, silent and deadly. Silas counted 5 of them, spreading out, surrounding the cabin. He woke Evelyn with a gentle touch on her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert. They're here, he whispered. She nodded, her face grim. She gently woke June and led her down into the cellar, whispering promises she didn't know if she could keep. You come back to us, Silas, Evelyn said, her hand on his cheek, her voice trembling just a little. I will, he promised. As he closed the cellar door, he heard June's small voice call out, Be careful, Daddy. The word didn't break him this time. It forged him. It turned his fear into steel. He waited. He let them get close. He could hear their whispers, their boots crunching on the dry earth. One of them crept onto the porch, trying the door. Silas held his breath. He aimed his rifle at the thin wood of the door, right where a man's heart would be. He could end this, right now. But then he heard a familiar voice, a voice that dripped with false piety and venom. Silas McCrae! It was Jedediah, his voice amplified by the quiet morning. Come out, sinner. The Lord demands a reckoning. Give me the harlot and the blasphemous ledger, and your life may yet be spared. Silas didn't answer. He moved silently to the side window, peering through a crack in the wood. He saw Jedediah standing by the old well, his arms outstretched as if he were preaching to the heavens. His men were in position, rifles ready. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. A thought struck him, cold and sharp. What if Jedediah wasn't the only one out there? What if his cult, his fold, was larger than they thought? What if the whole territory was crawling with his followers, even people in positions of power? He remembered the scarred man talking to the blacksmith. He remembered the looks he got in town. What if the town itself was complicit? What if the sheriff? He shook the thought away. Paranoia was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had to deal with the threat in front of him. He needed a distraction, something to even the odds. His eyes fell on the lantern hanging by the door, full of oil. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his mind. He crept to the back of the cabin, to a small window that was barely more than a slit in the wall. He could see one of Jedediah's men hiding behind the woodpile. Silas took a deep breath, lit the lantern's wick, and hurled it out the window. It shattered against the woodpile, and oil and flame exploded outwards. The man screamed as he was engulfed in fire, a terrifying human torch lighting up the dawn. The chaos was instantaneous. The other men started firing wildly at the cabin, bullets splintering the wood around Silas's head. He dropped to the floor, crawling towards the front window. He peered over the sill. Jedediah was shouting orders, trying to restore control, but his men were spooked. This was his chance. He took careful aim and fired. One of the men by the trees cried out and crumpled to the ground. 3 left. He crawled to the other side of the cabin. Another shot. Another man down. 2 left. It was just Jedediah and the scarred man now. They were pinned down behind the well. You are a demon, McCrae! Jedediah screamed, his voice raw with fury. You will burn for this! You first, Silas muttered, reloading his rifle. Suddenly he heard a new sound. Hoofbeats, coming fast, but not from the direction of the town, from the east. A lone rider, galloping hard. For a wild moment, he thought it was the sheriff, coming to save them. But as the rider got closer, Silas's blood ran cold. It wasn't the sheriff. It was someone he recognized, someone from his past. It was Deputy Miller, a man he had trained himself, a man he had trusted with his life. But Miller wasn't riding to help. He was riding to join Jedediah. He reined in his horse beside the well, his rifle in his hand. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. The town was compromised. The law was on Jedediah's side. They were utterly, completely alone. Trapped. He heard a noise from below. The cellar door was rattling. Evelyn was trying to get out. He scrambled over and pulled it open. "Stay down!" he hissed. "I heard the new horse," she said, her face pale. "Silas, what's happening?" "The law ain't coming," he said, the words tasting like poison. "It's already here." Her eyes widened in horror. She understood. They were surrounded not just by a cult, but by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. The situation had gone from desperate to impossible. As if to prove the point, a new voice called out from behind the well. Deputy Miller's voice. "It's over, Silas. Jedediah just wants what's his. Don't make me do this." Silas looked at Evelyn, at the cellar that held the only thing in the world that mattered to him now. He looked at the rifle in his hands. He had one last desperate card to play. It was a bluff, a gamble with all their lives. But it was all he had left. He took a deep breath. "You want the ledger, Jedediah?" he shouted, his voice ringing out in the quiet morning. "You want the key? You can have them. But you're not the only one who knows what's in this book." He held up the ledger so they could see it. "There's another name in here, a name that connects you to the death of a 10-year-old girl named Clara McCrae." Silence. A stunned, absolute silence from behind the well. He had no idea if it was true. It was a shot in the dark, a wild guess born of desperation. But he saw Jedediah stand up slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you say?" Jedediah asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. And in that moment, Silas knew. His wild guess had hit its mark. This wasn't just about gold anymore. This was about his daughter, and the man who had preached over her grave might just be the man who put her there. The fight had just become personal. The prairie held its breath. The sun was higher now, casting long, accusing shadows across the yard. Jedediah stared at the cabin, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Silas could see it in his eyes. Shock, fear, and a dawning, murderous rage. The bluff had worked, better than he could have ever imagined. He hadn't just found a weak spot, he'd struck the nerve of a hidden, festering wound. "You lie," Jedediah hissed, but there was no conviction in his voice. "The girl's death was an accident. The whole town knows it." "The town knows what they were told," Silas called back, his voice steady, belying the frantic beating of his heart. "But this ledger tells a different story. It tells of a secret meeting by Boone's Crossing. It tells of a deal gone wrong with a prospector. A deal you and your brother, Evelyn's husband, were a part of. My daughter saw you. Didn't she, Jedediah? She saw you commit a murder, and you silenced her." He was weaving a story out of thin air, spinning threads of conjecture and grief into a rope, hoping it was strong enough to hang a man. He glanced at Evelyn. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with a horrifying new understanding. The pieces were falling into place for her, too. The way her husband had been so nervous in the days after Clara's death. The way Jedediah had forbidden anyone from speaking the girl's name. It wasn't just a bluff, it was the truth. They both knew it. From behind the well, Deputy Miller shouted, "Don't listen to him, Jed. He's trying to trick you." But it was too late. The poison had been planted. The scarred man looked at Jedediah, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. A prophet could be forgiven for greed. But the murder of a child, that was a different kind of sin. This was Silas's chance. While their faith in their leader was shaken, he had to press the attack. "It's over, Jedediah," Silas yelled. "The truth is in this book, and once the circuit judge sees it, your fold will scatter like ashes in the wind." That was the final straw. Jedediah's righteous facade shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath. He raised his rifle and fired, not at the window, but at his own man, the one with the scar. The man looked down at the hole in his chest. a look of utter surprise on his face before he crumpled into the dust. "There will be no witnesses," Jedediah screamed, his voice cracking with madness. "The Lord demands a cleansing, fire and blood." He and Miller opened fire, a relentless barrage that tore the cabin to pieces. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Silas and Evelyn dove to the floor, crawling towards the back of the room as bullets ripped through the walls. "We have to get out of here," Evelyn gasped, her face pale with dust and fear. "The cabin is a death trap." "The cellar," Silas said. "Now!" He laid down covering fire, shooting blindly through the window, forcing Miller and Jedediah to take cover. Evelyn scrambled to the trapdoor, pulling it open. "June! Honey, stay back!" she yelled. She turned to Silas. "There's a small tunnel at the back of the cellar. It was for drainage. It leads out to the creek bed. It might be big enough." It was a sliver of hope. "Go," Silas ordered. "I'll hold them off. Get June and run. Follow the creek north. Don't stop for anything." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "You are," he said, grabbing her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You're going to take your daughter, and you're going to live. You're going to take that gold and find a place where the name Cartwright means nothing. That's an order." He softened his voice. "Please, Evelyn, let me do this one good thing. Let me save a family." Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. She knew he was right. She squeezed his hand, 100 unspoken words passing between them in that one touch. Then she disappeared into the cellar. Silas was alone. He listened until he could no longer hear their movements. He said a silent prayer that the tunnel was still clear, that they would make it. Then he turned his attention back to the fight. He was outgunned and surrounded. The cabin was failing. He was bleeding from a dozen small cuts from flying splinters. His leg was on fire. He was going to die here. A strange sense of calm washed over him. He had spent 10 years waiting for death, hiding from it. Now he would face it on his feet. For Clara, for June, for the man he used to be. He took a deep breath, kicked open the front door, and charged out into the sunlight, firing his revolver, a wild yell ripping from his throat. His attack was so unexpected, so insane, that it took Miller and Jedediah completely by surprise. Miller was too slow. Silas's first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second caught him in the chest. The deputy fell, his eyes wide with the shock of his own mortality. Now it was just him and Jedediah, the preacher and the sinner. They stood 20 paces apart, the bodies of their men scattered around them. The whole world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "It ends now," Silas said, his voice low and ragged. Jedediah smiled, a terrible, broken thing. "It ended 10 years ago, Sheriff, by the creek." They fired at the same time. The world exploded in a starburst of white-hot pain. Silas felt the bullet slam into his side, stealing his breath, buckling his knees. He fell, his own gun clattering to the ground. Through a swimming, gray haze, he saw Jedediah still standing. The preacher was clutching his stomach, a dark stain spreading across his black coat, but he was upright. He took a staggering step forward, raising his pistol to finish the job. Silas closed his eyes, a single thought echoing in his mind. "I'm sorry, Clara," but the final shot never came. Instead, he heard another gunshot, a different sound, a shotgun blast, loud, deafening. He forced his eyes open. Jedediah was on his back, a massive, bloody hole in his chest. And standing over him, smoke curling from the barrel of a shotgun, was Evelyn. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She hadn't run. She had sent June through the tunnel, and then she had come back for him. She ran to his side, dropping to her knees, her hands pressing against the wound in his side. "No, no, no," she sobbed. "Stay with me, Silas. Stay awake." He tried to smile. "Told you," he coughed, blood flecking his lips. "You're still bossy." She let out a choked, tearful laugh. "You stubborn, stupid, beautiful man." From the creek bed, a small figure emerged. It was June running towards them, her face streaked with tears. She knelt beside them, taking his hand. "You promised you'd come back," she whispered. He looked from Evelyn's desperate, loving face to June's tear-filled eyes. He had done it. He had saved them. He had found his redemption in the heart of the storm. As his vision started to fade to black, he held on to June's small hand. "And I did," he whispered. The world came back in pieces. The smell of mint and clean linen, the feeling of a warm blanket, the soft, rhythmic sound of a little girl reading aloud, stumbling over the long words. Silas opened his eyes. He was in his own bed. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes dancing in the air. His side was a dull, throbbing ache, but he was alive. Evelyn was sitting in a chair beside the bed, mending one of his shirts. She looked up and saw his eyes were open. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Welcome back, Sheriff," she said softly. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, not just for the bullet wound in his side, but for the deeper wounds in his soul. The real sheriff had eventually shown up, drawn by the sound of the battle. He'd taken one look at the carnage, at Jedediah's body, at the corrupt deputy, and listened to Evelyn's story. He'd seen the ledger, and he had declared the case closed. Self-defense, he'd called it, and a long overdue justice. They found the lockbox, buried right where Evelyn said it would be. It was full of more gold than Silas had ever seen. But they didn't run. They stayed. They rebuilt. Evelyn planted a garden that exploded with life and color. June, no longer haunted, filled the cabin with her laughter and her terrible harmonica playing. Silas taught her how to track animals, how to read the clouds. He carved her a whole family of wooden birds. The cabin, once a tomb for his grief, became a home. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, the sound of stories being read by the fire, the quiet, comfortable silence of people who belonged together. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were no longer menacing. They were just memories, reminders of the long, dark road that had brought them to this place of light. One evening, as the first chill of autumn settled over the prairie, they were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out. June was curled up between them, half asleep. "What you did, Silas," Evelyn said, her voice quiet. "Back there, saying that about Clara. How did you know?" Silas looked up at the vast starry sky. "I didn't," he admitted, "but I knew him. Men like Jedediah, their evil isn't simple. It's a tangle of roots that spreads and chokes everything around it. I just pulled on a thread, and the whole ugly thing came undone." He looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in a decade. "He took my family. It seemed right that he should lose his empire because of it." Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand finding his in the cool evening air. They sat like that for a long time, watching the constellations wheel across the sky. They were no longer three strangers thrown together by violence and desperation. They were a family, forged in fire and bound by something stronger than blood. A family built on second chances. Silas thought about the man he had been, the ghost hiding from the world. He thought about the knock on the door that had changed everything. Sometimes salvation doesn't come in a flash of divine light. Sometimes it comes barefoot, covered in dirt, and calls you by a name you thought you'd lost forever. Sometimes the most important thing you can ever do is just get up and answer the door. If you enjoyed this story and you believe that even in the darkest of nights, there's always a chance for a new dawn, then do us a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the moments that change everything. And let us know in the comments, if you were Silas, would you have opened the door?